October of 1781. Yorktown, Virginia, in the young United States of America. There is a dinner being held. On one side sits officers in blue and white coats, Americans and French. On the other side sit men in red, the British. The Battle of Yorktown had been a bloody campaign, but it had finally ended. The final nail in the coffin had been hammered, and American independence seemed assured. At the end of the fighting, the Americans had organized a dinner with the British. French Commander Rochambeau raises his glass. "The United States," he toasts. The King of France, George Washington, General of the American Continental Army, raises his glass in response. General Charles Cornwallis, the British commander, raises his drink as well. "The King," he toasts. Washington smiles a little bit and specifies, "Of England. Can find him there and I'll drink him a full bumper." Indeed, it was an uncomfortable dinner. The end of the First British Empire was coming. But still, the officers of the three nations were willing and comfortable enough to come together for this dinner. All except one. You see, the Americans invited all high-ranking British officers to the dinner, except one. One officer was so nefarious and despised by the Americans after an incident in North Carolina that they could not bring themselves to invite him to the dinner. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to tell you the story of Bloody Tarleton the Butcher. On August 21st, 1754, a baby named Banastre Tarleton was born in the city of Liverpool, one of the larger cities of Great Britain. Just 1 month earlier, a young lieutenant colonel from the British colony of Virginia named George Washington led British-American forces against the French in the Battle of Fort Necessity. Though nobody realized it at the time, Great Britain was about to be thrust into a larger war, the largest war the world had ever seen, a conflict that would become known as the 7 Years' War. Perhaps the massive war had an impact on the psychology of the young Tarleton. His family was politically active after all. Banastre's brother would become a member of Parliament, and his father was the mayor of Liverpool at one point. Though, at his heart, Tarleton's father was a merchant who traded extensively with the American colonies, and his father, Banastre's grandfather, owned a ship and traded with the colonies as well. One such good Tarleton's grandfather traded was slaves from Africa. The World War ended in 1763, with glory having been brought to the British Empire. French holdings in America were all but lost to the British, and the race for America was seemingly over. However, Britain found itself in heaps of debt that many in Parliament believed could be paid by taxing the Americas. After all, the war had been fought to their benefit. Tarleton was surely aware of the situation while he, as a young man, was educated at the Middle Temple before going to the University College in Oxford to become a lawyer for his great British Empire. Tarleton was fairly upper class and seemed to have grown up with a silver spoon in his mouth. It appears as if he failed to learn some lessons in restraint and self-discipline, as he received a fortune following his father's death, but the young Tarleton spent his money in less than a year on gambling and women at a place called the Cocoa Tree in London. Perhaps out of a need for a source of money, or in need of some structure in his life, or perhaps simply because of the prestige of serving in the British Empire, Banastre Tarleton joined the armed forces of Great Britain. However, like other members of the wealthy class, Tarleton simply purchased a commission as a cavalry officer in the 1st Dragoon Guards. Tarleton went through some training, his sharp wit making him an excellent horseman and leader of small forces. Though he purchased his way into the military, he did not need to make any further purchases, and instead rose through the ranks by merit all the way to lieutenant colonel. His training was going well in these young days, but perhaps he longed for something more. Perhaps he wanted to prove himself as just as a great officer in another war. He got his chance soon enough as, in 1775, tensions between the British government and the American colonists reached a breaking point. Shots were fired, and the colonies were declared to be in a state of rebellion. Tarleton wished to go fight in this new war, but he still had training. Perhaps it was arrogance in Tarleton's mind that led to him making his next decision. He was already a gifted officer. He didn't need this training, not when there was a war to be fought, and after all, how long could a war against the American farmers be? Tarleton left his training without completing it, making his way over to Cork, Ireland, another dominion of the Empire. There, he volunteered to fight under the command of British General Charles Cornwallis, who was assembling a British army to set sail to capture the colony city of Charleston, South Carolina, as the critical southern trading city had fallen into the hands of the rebels. It was under Cornwallis, alongside his 2,000 Irish troops, that Tarleton was able to go out on the lengthy voyage across the sea. June 28, 1776. The Battle of Sullivan's Island. The colonists put up more of a resistance than Tarleton thought. The might of the British fleet bombarded the South Carolinian Fort Sullivan outside Charleston, hoping to clear the way for an invasion of Charleston itself. At first, the battle seemed to be going in the Empire's favor. The fort was adorned with a blue and white flag that was meant to represent the rebelling South Carolinians. The British guns shot the flag down. Victory was at hand. However, to the surprise of the British, and surely Tarleton as well, one South Carolinian militiaman went out, picked up the flag, and brought it back to the fort, holding it in place while making himself a target until a new flag stand was brought. The South Carolinians cheered and continued to hold as their own cannons tore the British ships apart. Finally, the British realized that the campaign was too costly and pulled back. South Carolina had held off the British Empire. The British returned to New York City, one of the major strongholds and headquarters for the British Empire in America, where Tarleton fell under the command of British General William Howe. The area around New York City and Boston was a hot spot for combat, as the cities were held by the British, while the so-called Patriots, or rebels, held the countryside, besieging the British who hid in the cities. Nevertheless, it was the rebels who spent time freezing in the cold, while the British enjoyed parties held by local American wealthy loyalists. When he was not enjoying life in New York City, Colonel Tarleton had one mission: find Charles Lee. Charles Lee was a rebel general of the so-called United States of America that had recently declared its independence from the British Empire. Charles Lee in particular had been one of the members of high command for the South Carolinians at the Battle of Sullivan's Island, and was now one of the officers in charge of the U.S. forces in New Jersey, second in command only to George Washington himself. Day and night, Tarleton and the dragoons he commanded scouted out the New Jersey countryside, looking for any trace of Charles Lee. Where's Charles Lee?
Charles Lee. Any word on Lee? I would say the same of Charles Lee. Charles Lee. Where is Charles Lee? Charles Lee. Charles Lee. Charles Lee. Charles Lee. Where are you, Charles? Charles Lee. Charles Lee. Where is Charles Lee? Charles Lee. Charles Lee. Charles Lee. Charles Lee. Where is Charles Lee gone? Give me Lee!
One day, General Charles Lee is in a house in Basking Ridge, spending the night in a dressing gown, when he hears a knock at the door. He's confused. Who could be calling so late at night? The sleepy Lee goes to the door and opens it, only to find a British dragoon wearing his green dragoon's jacket while on his horse outside his door. Tarleton had surrounded the house with his forces and captured General Lee, second in command of the American forces.
Charles Lee!
Indeed, it was through feats like that earned Tarleton more promotions and more troops to command. By the end of 1776, he was 22 years old, the same age George Washington had been at the start of the 7 Years' War oh so long ago. Indeed, Tarleton would find himself on the same battlefield as George Washington, clashing with the Americans time and time again, and often being wounded himself. In July of 1778, the British in New York found themselves in possession of several American loyalist forces who wanted to fight for their empire. After all, the American colonists were not all rebels. However, that didn't change the fact that Americans were looked down upon by the British as being inferior, unintelligent, and clumsy. Tarleton was given the duty of organizing these loyalists into a proper unit, And so, the British Legion was formed out of volunteers from Philadelphia known as the Caledonian Volunteers, as well as other units known as the Royal American Reformers, the West Jersey Volunteers, and the Roman Catholic Volunteers. The New York Dragoons, Philadelphia Light Dragoons, the Prince of Wales American Volunteers, the 16th Light Dragoons, and more all had members who combined to form this British Legion, all dressed in sharp green uniforms. This loyalist force was tasked with light and fast-moving cavalry, infantry, and even artillery forces. It wasn't long before the unit became known as Tarleton's Raiders. It's 1780. Charleston has fallen. Having originally arrived in America facing defeat at Charleston, Tarleton was now in command of his own unit as he participated in the group of forces that entered the city. Tarleton had tasted revenge. However, his own soldiers went out into the streets of Charleston, attempting to sexually assault one of the women of the former rebel city. Never mind the fact that the women they assaulted were loyalist Americans like them. But why should Tarleton have cared? These were the spoils of war, and, after all, the Americans were inferior and were a rebel people. Indeed, Tarleton was steadily growing a reputation for cruelty. He already was vocal in disapproving of Cornwallis's more slow and steady strategy, while hoping to win the hearts and minds of the Southerners. In South Carolina, at the Battle of Monk's Corner, Tarleton had led a surprise attack that killed several American militiamen, slaughtering surrendering Americans as his men raped several women at a nearby plantation. The event was so cruel that the commanding British officers of the operation, Major Patrick Ferguson and James Webster, had the perpetrators sent to a British camp outside Charleston and had them tried and whipped. But it was nothing compared to the infamous event that Tarleton was a part of that occurred later that year. The British were taking control of the southern colonies, namely South Carolina, but Cornwallis's forces were being harassed by American forces based out of North Carolina. Seeking to pacify North Carolina, Cornwallis led his troops north, passing into the border region between North and South Carolina, known as the Waxhaws, centering around the tiny North Carolinian village of Charlotte. The Waxhaws was a region deeply divided between patriots and loyalists, with stories about neighbors killing each other in the middle of the night being not that uncommon. One report speaks of a Waxhaw man who was driven mad by the stresses that came with life in the area that he broke down and began attacking everyone in sight before snapping out of it. The arrival of Cornwallis's forces did not help things, as they battled mostly Virginian militia forces in the area, outsiders to the Waxhaws. In order to deal with the Virginians, Cornwallis dispatched the British Legion under the command of Tarleton. May 19th, 1780. The Waxhaws Massacre. Tarleton and a Virginian commander named Abraham Buford stood on opposite sides of a battlefield in the Waxhaws. Tarleton and Buford met, as per the custom of battle at the time. Tarleton gave Buford one chance to surrender, an offer Buford rejected. And so, the two reformed their troops. However, Tarleton sent his forces to attack before Buford could finish reforming his troops, something that was in violation of the rules of war. According to eyewitnesses, the opening blows of the battle were brutal, with British Legion dragoons mangling American rearguard forces, dragoons, and even a field surgeon. Following the first blood, Tarleton himself led a wing of his troops in an attack. During the charge, Tarleton's horse was shot from underneath him, resulting in the horse landing on top of and pinning Tarleton to the ground. The British Legion saw this and believed that Tarleton was dead. The Americans had waited for the British to close in before firing a volley, which meant that they only got one volley in, leaving them virtually defenseless to the enraged British Legion crashing on top of them. Realizing that the situation was hopeless, many Americans began to surrender, and Buford sent out a white flag to indicate his surrender to Tarleton. Nevertheless, while the white flag was visible, the Legion continued to fight. Only a scant few Americans managed to escape, with 113 Americans killed and 147 wounded, compared to the 5 members of the British Legion killed and 12 wounded. Tarleton himself would call the battle a slaughter in that he could not restrain his men. Even Cornwallis would be horrified about the reports of the massacre, as the Legion had killed, wounded, and surrendering American soldiers where they lay. The only survivors who fled the battlefield were Buford and a few of his cavalrymen, who limped their way into a nearby church, where they received medical attention by the church congregants, including a young boy named Andrew Jackson. News of the massacre horrified the Americans, and word quickly spread. The young Andrew Jackson himself was inspired to join the militia to fight against the British, though he himself would be slashed by the sword of a British officer who, similar to Tarleton, was in command of an American loyalist force and under Cornwallis's leadership. The massacre was enough to cause many loyalists in the Waxhaws region, and indeed the South in general, to switch sides. New battle cries emerged for the Americans, including "Remember Buford" and "Tarleton's quarter," that is to say, give no quarter. Many in the South were mobilized to the Patriot cause. In one of the most decisive battles of the South, the Battle of Kings Mountain, Major Patrick Ferguson was killed by an American sniper. The American loyalists under Ferguson's command went to surrender to the American forces. However, as these soldiers had heard about the Waxhaw massacre, the Americans shot and killed the surrendering loyalists where they stood. Ever since the Battle of Kings Mountain, things were going poorly for the British in the South. One American officer by the name of Francis Marion, otherwise known by the name of the Swamp Fox, had launched a guerrilla campaign where the British roamed in North Carolina. Similar to his operations against Charles Lee, Tarleton was tasked with finding the Swamp Fox, but the clever American was never found by Tarleton. Marion was a popular celebrity among the North and South Carolinians who provided Marion and his men with quarter and aid, while Tarleton was possibly the most hated man in the South. During one battle, Tarleton lost 2 fingers on his right hand after being shot. When the British Legion was nearly wiped out in the Battle of Cowpens, Cornwallis realized that a new strategy was needed to be adopted, and that strategy was to push up into Virginia, rendezvous with the British Navy, and leave the American colonies for a chance to reorganize and launch a new attack. While moving into Virginia, Tarleton launched several raids. Tarleton targeted the Virginian legislature as the British moved into Virginia with the intent on capturing Virginian Governor Thomas Jefferson, though Jefferson managed to escape the raid. By 1781, the situation was desperate for the British. The British planned on going to the Virginian town of Yorktown to meet with the Navy and leave. However, the French had, by this point, joined the war against Britain and destroyed the British fleet in the Chesapeake Bay. Cornwallis's forces were stuck at Yorktown with the French Navy on one side of them and the French and American armies under the command of George Washington himself on the other. Tarleton and the severely weakened British Legion was stationed to hold Gloucester Point during the Battle of Yorktown, fighting the French Lauzun region, a foreign mercenary unit made mostly of German, Polish, and Irish mercenaries. It was in this clash that the British Legion lost a significant amount of its forces again. Tarleton again had his horse shot from underneath him and was wounded. Finally, a tired and bewildered Tarleton received news of General Cornwallis's surrendering at Yorktown. With a heavy heart, Tarleton surrendered as well. This was supposed to be his war. The war where he proved himself, and the war where he would become a hero. Now he was a prisoner of the Americans, and he wasn't invited to the dinner. Cornwallis tried to get Washington to make sure that the Loyalists under his command would be able to return to their normal lives, but Washington refused this. The British Legion had 2 choices: to flee to British Canada or to go to a prison camp in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Those who went to British Canada were evacuated to Nova Scotia before the officers were transferred over to other areas of the British Army and the Legion was formally disbanded, with many of the Loyalists settling down in Nova Scotia. But Tarleton? At the age of 27, he was paroled and returned to Great Britain. People cheered the return of Tarleton. In their eyes, even though he did fight a war that was lost, Tarleton was still a hero. He proceeded to write down a history of his campaigns in a book titled Campaigns of 1780 and 1781 in the Southern Provinces of North America, criticizing his fellow British officers and portraying himself in a favorable light. He sought to go down a more political path, eventually becoming an MP for Liverpool in Parliament. In Parliament, Tarleton was one of the more vocal supporters for the slave trade, doing his best to preserve the slave trade while becoming an enemy for the abolitionists. Great Britain would indeed eventually abolish the slave trade. By 1812, Tarleton, now a general, hoped to lead British forces in the Peninsular War, as the newly established United Kingdom now found itself at war with France, which was under the rule of the upstart Napoleon Bonaparte. France was fighting a campaign against Spain and Portugal, and Tarleton wished to be the spearhead to bring Napoleon down. However, the position was instead given to the Duke of Wellington. Tarleton went on to have a relationship with an actress and writer named Mary Robinson, the former mistress of the Crown Prince George IV, who he seduced on a bet. In 1783, Robinson had a miscarriage, and the two never had any children, though she wrote many of Tarleton's speeches in Parliament. Tarleton would go on to marry the wealthy Susan Bertie in 1798, however. He did have one illegitimate daughter named Benina Georgina in 1791, who he recognized as his daughter. At Leintwardine, Tarleton would pass away on January 15, 1833, at the age of 78. The British officer had lived a life of violence and brutality, basking in the glory of a war he fought with no honor and still lost. His war to prove himself was only the war to bring out the worst in him. Even today, in the Waxhaws region, some still remember the name of Bloody Tarleton. And that's going to wrap up this episode of Primus Academy. I hope you've enjoyed. Consider subscribing to the channel if you have not yet. Consider supporting me on Patreon if you want to see this channel continue. And check out my social media links in the description. Have a great day, ladies and gentlemen. Huge thanks to our patrons, including this month's $10 plus patron, Josh Adkins. Check out the description for more patrons and more info about how you can receive a shout out here.